Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Tom Neer, Chair of the Terry Lecture Committee, Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and Curator of Ichthyology at the Yale Peabody Museum. I'll repeat a little bit of what I did yesterday, just to acknowledge that the Dwight H. Terry Lectureship was established at Yale in 1905, represents a unique intersection of science and religion. Through this prestigious platform, as a community, we explore life's most profound questions about existence, morality, and the human spirit. Today, we are privileged to continue the Terry Lecture with Professor Peter Adamson, Professor of Late Ancient and Arabic Philosophy at Munich's Ludwig Maximilian University. Professor Adamson brings a remarkable breadth of expertise, having taught at King's College London and earning his BA from Williams College and his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Yesterday, I read a list of luminaries who were previous Terry lecturers. In the years following, I anticipate Professor Adamson will be added to those names that we mentioned in our introductions. Professor Adamson has made a large impact, both as an eminent scholar and a public intellectual, through his acclaimed podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Over a growing list of episodes numbering more than 800, Professor Adamson is democratizing philosophical knowledge. This requires the rare skill he exhibits to make complex philosophical ideas accessible without comprising scholarly excellence. Through his podcast, that has been downloaded over 45 million times, and a corresponding book series with Oxford University Press, Professor Adamson has demonstrated that rigorous academic work can resonate far beyond the academy. His commitment to collaborative scholarship and inclusive education makes him an ideal Terry lecturer. Yesterday, in outlining his ambitions aimed at global philosophy, Professor Adamson set a frame for his discussions that identifies a fundamental shift associated with modernity, where pre-modern religious thinking was characterized by skepticism, but has become dogmatic in modernity, while scientific thinking originated as dogmatic and shifted to a mode of skepticism. In this frame, Professor Adamson introduced ideas of epistemic theodicy and the problem of ignorance. I'm excited to see where he takes us on the second of these three Terry lectures. Please, again, join me in welcoming Professor Adamson.
Okay, thank you so much again, Tom, and thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to Brenna and Julia, wherever she is, for organizing this. So we're going to move on today with our second topic, and the idea here is going to be to look at ritual. And the reason I think this is important is that philosophers often think of religions as bodies of doctrines, almost like lists of propositions to which the religious adherents subscribe. But actually, religions are experienced by people in day-to-day life, not, I think, even primarily as a body of doctrines, and certainly not solely as a body of doctrines, but as a body of practices. And I think that this dimension of religion is something that philosophers often don't pay very much attention to. So it's more the province of maybe scholars of religion, people who do religious studies, or anthropologists, right? But I think that we can talk about it philosophically as well, and we can also talk about it in the context of the history of philosophy. So that's what I'm going to be doing this evening. And as yesterday, I'll just read out the lecture that I wrote for this occasion. So this is called Give Without Getting, Philosophical Critique and indeed Defense, as you'll be seeing, of Ritual. On any day that my favorite soccer team, Arsenal Football Club, is playing a game, and they just beat Real Madrid in the Champions League, I perform several long-observed rituals. I drink coffee out of my Arsenal coffee mug, I wear red socks, and during the game, when I'm not in the United States, I put on an Arsenal shirt. If it's a particularly important match, I might also hang up an old Arsenal flag in our living room. Should the team lose nonetheless, I at least feel that I've done all I could. Of course, I know that none of this has any causal effect, not least because I'm doing it in Germany, well away from the scene of the action. It's not even like wearing the shirt and chanting at the actual match, which might, however trivially, help influence the result. Yet a season or two ago, when I was drinking out of my Arsenal coffee cup and the handle came off in my hand, spilling hot coffee into my lap, I was less alarmed about the potential for burnt skin than by what this dire portent might mean for Arsenal's chance of winning the league. And they did not win the league. As a philosopher who, in theory, prides himself on his rationality, I must say that this gives me pause. Why do I, or rather, why do we, since I suppose that nearly all of us engage in this sort of behavior at least occasionally, continue to perform rituals despite being skeptical whether they will have any effect? There is, of course, a vast literature among anthropologists and scholars of religion on this topic. In this lecture, I'll take a different tack by considering how 3 philosophical texts from 3 independent global traditions defended ritual in the face of skeptical attack. They are, in the order I will discuss them, Iamblichus's On the Mysteries, the most famous part of the Mahabharata, which is called the Bhagavad Gita, meaning Song of the Lord, and the classical Confucian treatise called the Xunzi. Part of what they have in common is that all 3 forthrightly reject the most straightforward idea of what ritual is for, the quasi-economic rationale, which is sometimes called by the Latin tag do ut des, I give so that you give. According to that idea, we might perform the rain sacrifice so that it rains, offer up an animal in hopes of receiving healthy offspring in return, or indeed drink from a certain coffee cup in hopes of getting the football gods to send down a soft penalty decision in Arsenal's favor. Maybe that's even why we just won. Of course, I call them we. My daughter Johanna always tells me off for this, calling Arsenal we. She always says, "You're not playing, Dad." But I identify with them. So maybe that's even why we won. Although I didn't drink out of an Arsenal coffee cup, I feel like I'm getting maybe digressing too much into Arsenal. So let's get back on track. Our 3 texts would all agree that this understanding of ritual, this do ut des, I give so that you give, this understanding of ritual is not just false, but even impious. It falsely suggests that humans can manipulate the divine and shapes our relation to the heavenly gods in accordance with earthly desire. The most thoughtful defenses of ritual in these cultures were thus themselves skeptical towards an understanding of ritual as transaction. This left them in need of other reasons to continue performing the traditional rites, reasons that we will explore throughout this lecture. Of the 3 texts at issue here, On the Mysteries by Iamblichus has the most specific target. It responds to Porphyry, who, like Iamblichus, was a major Platonist philosopher of late antiquity and was in fact Iamblichus's teacher. Porphyry's own teacher, Plotinus, was a great figure, often seen as the founder of Neoplatonism. We don't need to get into what Neoplatonism, like whether it's a legitimate word or what, but these are all major Platonists of late antiquity. Plotinus took only an occasional interest in questions of religion, and then only because they came up in Plato, as in one fairly short treatise on the function of demons, or the daimones, in the Platonic dialogues. Porphyry was very different. He produced a well-informed and detailed attack on Christianity, and in the 4th and final section of his work on abstinence from killing animals, offered a survey of vegetarian practices among various peoples, including the Egyptians, Persians, Syrians, and Jews. This is a really interesting work about basically defending the idea that philosophers should be vegetarians. With this, we come to our topic of ritual, because On Abstinence by Porphyry is a defense of the idea that philosophers should not eat meat because they ought to avoid violence and should shun the bodily pleasure that comes along with meat eating. And the second section of the work considers what may be, from Porphyry's perspective, the most formidable challenge to his own position, which is not that meat tastes good. Actually, the fact that meat tastes good is a reason not to eat meat, because he's a Platonist, and bodily pleasure ties your soul to the body. So the problem is rather that in Roman society, religious rituals prominently included the sacrifice of animals, followed by communal eating of the meat. How could Platonist philosophers, who above all people should be concerned to uphold an appropriate relationship to the gods, refused to participate in these rituals. So this, I think, example bears out something that is more generally true, and I think something I'll explore more in the book version of the lectures, which is that late ancient Platonists in general were deeply religious figures, and Porphyry satisfies that criterion, as we'll be seeing Iamblichus even more clearly satisfies that criterion. Porphyry argues that to the contrary, so it's not that we need to sacrifice animals to the gods in order to be pious. To the contrary, abstinence from killing and eating animals is more reverent to the gods. There are 3 reasons we should sacrifice to the gods: to honor them, to give thanks, and to ask for benefits. Since killing animals is unjust, it cannot appropriately fulfill any of these 3 purposes. Porphyry's treatment of ritual sacrifice draws on earlier material, especially arguments given by Aristotle's student Theophrastus. But in a recent study on abstinence by Mira Tuominen, it has been argued that Porphyry goes beyond Theophrastus by denying that the gods would enjoy or appreciate any offerings of physical objects, for example, crops. This despite Porphyry's claim that originally sacrifices of grains were given to the gods and replaced by meat only in times of crop failure. This is kind of a strange idea. So they sacrificed animals because there were no wheat or barley or whatever the crops were to sacrifice. The philosopher's mode of sacrifice is more abstract than this. He says that to the highest God, we shall offer nothing perceived by the senses either by burning or in words, though lower gods may be suitably honored with hymns. Since the philosopher's business is thinking, they should give the gods fine thoughts, whereas it is for farmers, whose business is to raise crops, to offer corn and fruit. In this, the philosophers are not shirking their duty to sacrifice, but carrying out that duty better than anyone else. He writes, "The best offering to the gods is a pure intellect and a soul unaffected by passion." Sorry, I think I'll leave this slide up for a minute so you can look at it. I should have advanced it before. So these remarks fit with advice he gives in another work, which is a letter of philosophical advice that he wrote to his wife Marcella. He says, "You give God the greatest honors when you make your reasoning like him." Here too, Porphyry rejects the notion that physical sacrifices are appropriate for God. Instead, he says, argument shows that the divine is present everywhere and to everyone, but among humans the temple dedicated to him is nothing but reasoning, especially of the sage, and the honor rendered to God is from the one who knows him best. This is presumably none other than the sage, or the philosopher, who honors God through wisdom, and through wisdom adorns consecrated ground in his intelligence, forming his mind into a living statue that exalts God. For God needs nothing, and the sage needs only God. This idea that the sage or wise person, or maybe philosopher, the Greek is hosophos, for those who know Greek, this idea that the sage needs nothing but God obviously suggests that philosophers would be uninterested in ritual as a transaction with the gods. Indeed, back in his work on abstinence from eating animals, Porphyry writes dismissively of those who sacrifice to the spirits that are called demons or daimones, writing, "We, as far as possible, shall not need what those beings provide, that we make every effort drawing on the soul and on external things to become like God and those who accompany him. And this happens through dispassion, through precise distinctions about true beings, and through a life which is directed to these." Porphyry thus seems to give us an outstanding example of what modern-day scholar Guy Strumse has called the end of sacrifice. And that's Guy Strumse, not Porphyry. For Strumse, the move away from physical offerings was a seismic shift in late ancient culture, a transformation of the very concept of religion, he says. We see it with the Jews, who were obliged to cease sacrificing animals to God when the Second Temple was destroyed, earning them a degree of respect from philosophers like Porphyry, who disdained the do ut des attitude implied by pagan blood sacrifice. Actually, an interesting feature on abstinence is that Porphyry is very complimentary about the Jews, which is an interesting kind of perspective within late ancient religion, where we so often think about the relationship between pagans and Christians, or between Jews and Christians. Here we actually have pagans thinking about Jews. So we see it with Porphyry. We also see it with the decision of the Christian emperor Constantine II to put an end to what he called the madness of sacrifices. But the pagan practices were not going to disappear without a fight. We can now welcome onto the stage their greatest philosophical defender, Iamblichus. Though, as I say, he was a student of Porphyry's, he dares to instruct his own master on the subject of pagan rites in his work On the Mysteries, albeit while adopting the pseudonym of Adamson, an Egyptian priest. On the Mysteries is a response to a letter by Porphyry, which is lost, but can to some extent be reconstructed from Iamblichus' own response and a summary in Book 10 of Augustine's City of God. The topic at hand is theurgy, which literally means God-making or divinity-making. In other words, performing rituals that induce the gods to show themselves in the world, for instance, by animating statues. In that quotation just now from the letter that Porphyry wrote to his wife, Marcella, he said, we should make our minds into a living statue that exalts God. And that could actually be a reference to the theurgic practice of making animals come to life and move around. On the whole, Augustine describes Porphyry's position on theurgy as hopelessly conflicted. He says it fluctuates alternately between his claims to philosophy and the vice of sacrilege and vain curiosity. Porphyry thinks that theurgy can help to purify the lower soul, but does nothing to purify the rational soul. But Augustine is more pleased by Porphyry's letter, the one that solicited the response from Iamblichus, since here Porphyry departs from his usual position on theurgy, according to Augustine, by being consistently critical of pagan beliefs about demons and attempts to influence the gods. Sometimes humans even threaten the gods to get what we want, says Augustine, quoting Porphyry. However, Augustine notes that Porphyry framed his criticisms as mere requests for explanations, perhaps for fear of offending Anebo, an Egyptian priest to whom the letter was supposedly addressed, though this is evidently a literary conceit on Porphyry's part. Iamblichus duly adopts his own literary conceit by speaking as Abamon on behalf of Anebo. So Porphyry's pretending to write to this fictional person, and Iamblichus says, well, he's not in, so I'll respond to you in the guise of this other fictional person. There's a lot of game playing here going on. It sort of reminds me of the shenanigans that Renaissance humanists get up to, actually. So Iamblichus' task here is to answer Porphyry's probing and critical questions about pagan ritual practice. He does so as one Platonist responding to another, offering what one might describe as a philosophical account of theurgy, and indeed defense of theurgy. But we should use that word philosophical with caution in this context, since Iamblichus places theurgy above philosophy as a higher mode of approaching the gods. In fact, he blames Porphyry for remaining at the level of purely rational and philosophical argument, and thus failing to appreciate the higher achievements of the theurgist. In fact, he says, it's impossible to have a fully adequate understanding of theurgy, since part of its perfection is its very unknowability. Yet Iamblichus has plenty to say on the subject nonetheless. Like Porphyry, he rejects a transactional understanding of theurgic rituals. Regarding sacrifice, for instance, he writes as follows, one should never indulge in sacrifices only for the sake of conferring honor, in the way we honor our benefactors, nor for the sake of acknowledging graces, in return for the goods which the gods have bestowed upon us, nor yet by way of first fruits or return of gifts in recompense for the far superior gifts which the gods have provided for us. For all these procedures are common also to our dealings with men, and are borrowed from common social relations, whereas they do not at all preserve the utter superiority of the gods and their status as transcendent causes. Notice that here Iamblichus dismisses all three of the functions of sacrifice mentioned by Porphyry on abstinence. So I mentioned this before, that he said there's three reasons to sacrifice to the gods: to bestow honor, to give thanks, and to seek benefits, and killing animals doesn't satisfy any of these three purposes. And Iamblichus, almost as if he's commenting on that passage, says, these are not the reasons we sacrifice to the gods. Admittedly, he doesn't rule these three things out as a partial reason for sacrifice, but he denies that we sacrifice only to bestow honor and so on. The comparison to relationships, though, the relationship between humans, though, suggests quite a dismissive attitude towards this rationale for sacrifice. It's as if Iamblichus wishes to rule out, some 1.5 millennia in advance, the quasi-economic understanding of ritual advanced by some modern anthropologists and scholars of religion. So what alternative rationale is left? one that is philosophical in the broader sense of presupposing Platonist metaphysics, but not philosophical in the narrow Porphyrian sense of approaching the gods with the tools of reason. Iamblichus rejects this explicitly, writing, "It isn't reflection that unites the theurgist to the gods. If it were, we wouldn't need theurgy, because theoretical philosophy would do the trick. Nor is virtue in the soul enough, and for the similar reason that perfectly virtuous people could in that case dispense with theurgic rituals. This may remind us of Augustine's polemics against the Pelagians. I mentioned this yesterday. So the Pelagians held that one may merit salvation using one's innate resources. Against this, as we saw, Augustine argued that divine grace is needed, and something similar is true for Iamblichus. When we perform rituals, we are asking the gods to reveal themselves to us. We can't force them to do that, right? They have to do it as a divine gift, as it were. But the parallel is inexact, because Iamblichus is not denying that humans can become perfectly virtuous. That's what philosophy is for. He also says that the gods only associate with people who are good. Still, goodness is only a necessary and not sufficient condition for that association. The reason we need theurgy and not just virtue is that ritual practice is unique in its capacity to unite the human with the divine. The practitioner uses symbols to elicit participation between himself and the gods. Since, as Porphyry himself told Marcella, the gods are present everywhere and to everyone, the theurgist simply needs to do something that allows this presence to manifest itself. One might compare the procedure to tuning a radio to get a signal that's there all the time. Or, to stay closer to Iamblichus's ideas, we could say that theurgy is like the instrumental cause, which is one of the co-causes recognized in Neoplatonism, meaning a cause that merely facilitates the action of a primary cause, like a Platonic form. So, for example, if you use a flint to create friction, that would be the instrumental cause for bringing about a participation in the form of fire. The form is the real cause, because we're Platonists, right? I mean, at least I'm a Platonist. I don't know about you. So if we're Platonists, then the cause of fire is the form of fire, and you just bring it about here and now by doing something that allows fire to manifest in the earthly realm. We can see how fundamentally Iamblichus relies on Platonism from the fact that the mechanism of participation is what he calls affinity. There should be a relation of likeness between the ritual and the divine principle with which one wishes to unite, just as sensible particulars are like the forms in which they participate. As he says, the rule of cult assigns like to like. This explains the mechanics of various rituals, including features that appalled Porphyry, like the use of obscene words and imagery. Iamblichus explains that the latter evokes the generative power of certain gods. So, for example, they talk about rituals where you carry enormous sort of puppets of genital organs through the streets, right? And Porphyry's like, why are we doing this, man? This is awful. And Iamblichus says, well, it symbolizes the generative power of the gods. Perfectly straightforward and all above board. Since there are many gods, which have various natures and preside at various levels, a wide variety of theurgic practices is needed to connect with them. While many of the rituals to which Iamblichus alludes sound like magic, there is also prayer, which he says renders us akin to the gods through acts. Admittedly, mere similarity is not fully satisfying as an explanation, because likeness can also exist within the natural sphere. Rather, we should think of in terms of identity, unity, and concord, or as Iamblichus says, friendship and affinity, and the relation that binds together creators with their creations and generators with their offspring. This is preferable in part, I think, because it allows the gods to reveal themselves to the theurgist willingly, rather than as an automatic response to the theurgic action. In this respect, the comparison to arranging for participation in Platonic forms is less apt, since there's no suggestion in Plato that the forms allow participation in them by any kind of volition. The upshot is that physical sacrifice, as well as the intellectual sacrifice envisioned by Porphyry, is for Iamblichus an effective means for uniting with the gods. He's no less skeptical than Porphyry when it comes to the idea of a quid pro quo between gods and humans. And in a way, he's even more skeptical when it comes to the appropriate relationship with the divine. Porphyry thinks that this relationship can be realized through theoretical contemplation. So he says, sacrifice your thoughts to the god. Iamblichus, by contrast, denies that ritual can be replaced with philosophy and insists that physical sacrifices should be carried out. So he says, sacrifice a pig to the god. I choose the example of a pig advisedly, both to underscore that Iamblichus defends not just sacrifice in general, but animal sacrifice in particular, unlike Porphyry, and because the later Platonist philosopher and theologian Proclus apparently sacrificed piglets, judging by remains found in the so-called House of Proclus at Athens. As far as the later pagan Platonists were concerned, the end of sacrifice had not yet come after all. The mainstream Indian culture, built on the sacred texts of the Vedas, was likewise committed to the practices of ritual and sacrifice. Such practices were constitutive for the lives of householders and for the Brahmins, the priestly caste who advised and cooperated with them in the performance of rituals. And as in yesterday's lecture, I'm going to use the word Brahminical to refer to this culture that comes from the Vedas as we go on. So what were these rituals? Well, they ranged from relatively humble, though frequently performed rituals like the offering of milk into a fire at dawn and dusk. This was called the Agnihotra, to such extravagant ceremonies as the horse sacrifice, the Ashvamedha. That involved massive expenditure, including the sacrifice of hundreds of other animals, in addition to an especially valuable horse, one said to be worth 1,000 cows. The full ceremony stretched over a whole year, so you would let the horse wander around in the wilderness for the year before sacrificing it finally. The centrality of these practices is evidenced by passages in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedas. For instance, in the famous description of a sacrifice of a great human body, or Purusha, that produces the seasons, the caste system, celestial bodies, gods, and so on. Similarly, the oldest of the Upanishads, the Great Forest Upanishad, begins with a passage drawing parallels between parts of the cosmos and the parts of a sacrificial horse. So there's clearly more going on in these early texts than a straightforward transactional understanding of ritual, such as we've just been seeing being rejected by Porphyry and Iamblichus. In fact, in these ancient texts, we even find the idea of sacrifice in thought, as in a passage from the Rig Veda, which seems to describe a purely intellectual version of the sacrifice. Kindling Agni with his mind, the mortal should follow his visionary thought. I have kindled Agni with the dawning lights. Nonetheless, Vedic culture was indeed built upon the idea that a certain ritual should solicit a certain result. A whole philosophical school, the Mimamsa, took as its primary challenge the analysis of ritual commands, such as one who desires heaven should perform the Agnihotra, the fire sacrifice. The Mimamsakas pointed out that such injunctions, that's a good example of something I would have to cut out from a podcast, actually. But live, you get all the mistakes. So such injunctions, which for them are the essential core of the Veda, can do nothing by themselves. There needs to be an agent who carries out the ritual or becomes responsible for it, and this responsibility will fall on someone only if they have a desire for the expected result, in this case, heaven. To get the point across, Mimamsa draws parallels to more everyday cases like someone who wants to be well-nourished should drink milk. As this example suggests, there's no guarantee that the desired result will ensue from the enjoined action. Sometimes people drink milk and still get sick, right? The point is rather that a desire for the result is presupposed if we are even to make sense of such actions as drinking milk or performing the fire sacrifice. So the thought here is, if you don't want to get to heaven, then you don't have to perform the ritual. So it's means-end reasoning in their view. From this sketch, it should also already be clear that Buddhism, with its central idea of abandoning all desire, amounted to a forthright rejection of Vedic ritual culture. The Buddhists did not just scorn the Brahmin ceremonies as inefficacious, but went so far as to reject the very idea that action must be explained with reference to desire. Furthermore, the Buddhists and their fellow renouncers, the Jains, who we heard about yesterday, were aghast at animal sacrifices. They developed a counter-ethic, which they called ahimsa, meaning non-violence, leading to the famous practices, one of which I mentioned yesterday, so like sweeping insects out of the way when you walk. Another example is that Jain monks don't ever use fire. They don't light fires because small insects could fly into the fire and be consumed. Maybe not a coincidence that one of the central standard daily practices of Vedic ritual is to light a fire, right? The Brahminical intellectual tradition needed to respond, and did so in two ways. First, they too began to practice nonviolence, albeit in a less extreme form. We find, for instance, talk of making a sacrificial bird out of dough in order to avoid committing a violent act. The Jains rejected this as inadequate because the intention is still violent. So there's stories about people finding themselves in hell, even though they only sacrificed like a bred animal, because like, well, you were trying to kill an animal, right? That's what you wanted to do. So here you are. So that's one reason that they rejected this. That's one reason that's one way that the Vedic people responded, by saying, well, no, we're nonviolent too, just like you are. And second, they devised arguments in defense of the Vedic sacrifices and other rituals. These two responses are found, for example, in the Manu Smriti, the Laws of Manu, a Vedic text, or Brahminical text, which insists that if an animal is killed in a sacrificial context, this does not count as violent, because the purpose is sort of religious and not violent. And the Manu Smriti sides with the Mimamsa perspective against that of the Buddhists by saying that it is impossible to divest oneself of desires. It says, desire is rooted in intention, rites originate from intentions, all vows, disciplines, and dharmas are known to be born of intentions, adding, whatever anyone does is the doing of desire. Similarly, the Great Forest Upanishad says that desire leads to a resolution to act, which leads to the action, and the action brings the fruit of action. By far, the most famous and influential text to address these concerns is the Song of the Lord, or Bhagavad Gita, a celebrated philosophical dialogue inserted into the midst of the great epic poem Mahabharata, which is within the Brahminical culture. The Gita tells of how the mighty warrior Arjuna was convinced by his charioteer, Krishna, who was in fact an avatar of the god Vishnu, to play. We were just talking about chauffeurs before the talk with a couple of us over here. His chauffeur is a god. Could happen. So the setup of the Bhagavad Gita is Arjuna is one of the greatest of the warriors in this kinship-based war, and he's hesitating to fight in the war, and the role of Krishna is to convince him he should do it, right? And you can see from that, as I'm about to say, that there's like a concern with violence here, right? The Gita is a complicated text that shows signs of numerous layers of composition. So it would perhaps be an overstatement to suggest that the defense of ritual is the central theme of the work. Still, it's clearly a central theme, one that comes up in numerous places explicitly, in addition to the fact that engaging in blood sacrifice seems to be symbolically represented by Arjuna's going to war. So he's hesitating to do something violent, and Krishna's like, go ahead, it's okay. This is your job. One might add that a concern with violence and ritual is also evident in other parts of the Mahabharata. This context makes itself felt from the opening chapter of the Gita, as when Arjuna says that rather than kill his family relations, he would prefer to become a mendicant, which might mean a Vedic mendicant, but it could also be an allusion to the renouncer movements, like the Buddhists and Jains. He also proclaims that he has no desire for the typical goods of the warrior class, the Kshatriya class, like victory, kinship, and pleasure. Arjuna is thinking like a Mimamsaka. If he has no desire for that which an action may achieve, then why should he perform the action? To this, Krishna responds that Arjuna should act without desire. He says, never should the fruits of action be your motive. This idea of non-attached action is probably the best-known philosophical concept in the Gita, and it's explicitly applied to the topic of ritual and sacrifice. Krishna criticizes those who, full of desires, intent upon heaven, offer rebirth as the fruit of action, and are addicted to many specific rites aimed at the goal of enjoyment and power. And somewhat later, he advises Arjuna, perform action for the purpose of sacrifice, free from attachment. Krishna then is not thinking like a Mimamsaka, the way Arjuna is. He wants Arjuna, and by extension all of us, to sacrifice with no regard to the traditionally promised fruits connected to sacrifice. So much as Porphyry raises this question, like, why should we sacrifice if we're not trying to get stuff? So Arjuna says, well, I don't care about the stuff, so why should I do this? And this being fighting in a war, right? But I'm saying that's a symbolic sort of allegory for performing sacrifice. So just like Iamblichus, Krishna's job is to explain why we should perform rituals, even if we're not trying to get something out of it. Okay. So what's the reason? Why should we perform sacrifice? Well, judging by the last passage I just cited, there is no further reason. Sacrifice is quite literally its own reward. But this obviously will not convince a skeptic. Fortunately, the Gita has much more to say about this topic. Failing to act completely is not an option, for one thing. Whatever you do something, at least so long as you are embodied. So you can renounce the fruits of action, but not action itself. Not unlike Iamblichus, the Gita situates this endorsement of action within a broader cosmological context, with an emphasis on our orientation toward the divine rather than towards earthly rewards. In other words, through ritual performance, what it calls the to-be-performed action should not be carried out with the purpose of achieving fruits like wealth or the birth of a child. But still, the to-be-performed action does have a purpose. This sort of action serves, it says, to hold the universe together, in imitation of God himself, who likewise acts without attachment. The attitude to be adopted by the sacrificer is one of devotion, bhakti, which becomes a key technical word in the Gita. Not only that, but every action we perform, even those that do not take the shape of traditional rituals, should be undertaken in this spirit as a sacrifice to God. One can sacrifice actual physical things, of course, but also one can sacrifice one's senses, one can sacrifice the study of scriptures, one can even sacrifice one's breath. This too recalls what we saw in Iamblichus, who accepted the purely intellectual sacrifice proposed by Porphyry, while retaining also the sacrifice of animals and other physical things to the gods. Also reminiscent of Iamblichus is that the Gita valorizes knowledge, but does not see it as the highest of attainments. It is outranked by meditation, renunciation of the fruits of action, and ultimately by peace. But of course there are differences too. One is that for Iamblichus, the diversity of sacrifices was linked to a polytheistic understanding of the divine realm as multi-level and multi-form. In the Gita, by contrast, we find a strong tendency towards monotheism, or if not monotheism, then at least the recognition of a single god, Brahman, above all others. Actually, ultimately, Krishna reveals himself to be the incarnation of this highest god. And there's a scene which people often compare to the moment in the book of Job when God appears and speaks from the whirlwind, and there's this awesome sight, like not awesome in the modern day sense, but awesome like as in awe-inspiring description of God revealing himself. So the Gita says, sacrifices are of many kinds spread out before Brahman, this one God. Know them all to be born of action, thus knowing you shall be released. Released, that is, from the bonds of action. This liberation might plausibly be identified with the peace mentioned in the passage I just cited, where it says that peace is the best thing that you can have, right? Better than knowledge, even. One might see all this as a philosophical revision and justification of the ritualistic Vedic religion, or alternatively as something completely new. Angelica Malina writes that the Gita is, as she says, launching a religious alternative to Vedic religion that not only draws on new ascetic and philosophical notions, but also confirms the validity of sacrifice. Either way, the Gita certainly distances itself from a core idea that had been used to rationalize Brahminic culture, namely the unbreakable link between action and desire. Remember the Manu Smriti saying, you can't act without desire, right? The Buddhists are wrong. You can't give up desire. It makes no sense. The Gita is saying, no, it makes sense. This is exactly what you should do, but you should continue to perform the Vedic sacrifices, just in an unattached way. On this point, then, the work sides with the Buddhists, encouraging us to achieve detachment from desire and thus from the results of action. This means that the Gita needs to answer a puzzle that also confronts Buddhists. Even if we accept that it is impossible to avoid action entirely, how is one to choose one action over another? A full discussion of this issue would take us too far afield, but a first pass at an answer might be that the Gita endorses dharma, which is the set of duties and roles belonging to each person in light of their social category, whereas Buddhism instead sees a positive trait as compassion, the positive trait of compassion as emerging from the negative state of being unattached. So this is why Arjuna, as a warrior prince, should fight. It is his assigned dharma to do so. But he should do so without desiring the destruction of his enemies, the rewards that may come with victory, or indeed anything else. And when it's your dharma to perform rituals because you're a householder, or to assist householders in the performance of rituals, like because you're a Brahminical priest, that's your dharma, so you should do that. Okay? You should just accept your role, your allotted role, and act accordingly. The theme of desire brings us on naturally to our third text, the Xunzi. So following on from the Analects, the Lunyu, and the Mengzi, which is sometimes called the Mencius, but I'm going to use the Chinese names. So the Lunyu is the Analects of Confucius that report his teachings, and the Xunzi, similarly, is a major source of Confucianism from the Warring States period that represents the teachings of a Confucian sage, in this case, Xunzi. Ritual is an abiding theme of classical Confucianism in general and of the Xunzi in particular, which is unsurprising since Xunzi held office as master of rituals in the state of Jixia. The treatise named for him devotes a chapter specifically to the topic, which begins as follows. From what did ritual arise? I say, humans are born having desires. When they have desires but do not get the objects of their desire, then they cannot but seek some means of satisfaction. If there is no measure or limit to their seeking, then they cannot help but struggle with each other. If they struggle with each other, then there will be chaos. And if there is chaos, then they will be impoverished. The former kings hated such chaos, and so they established rituals and righteousness in order to divide things among people, to nurture their desires, and to satisfy their seeking. They caused desires never to exhaust material goods, and material goods never to be depleted by desires, so that the two support each other and prosper. This is how ritual arose. Given what we've seen in the Neoplatonists and in the Gita, it's remarkable that Xunzi here sees ritual not as an expression of desire, such that one performs rituals to get what one wants, but on the contrary, as a way of bringing desire under control. In the following chapter, Xunzi gives the example of a village drinking ceremony, in which elaborate greetings, a set seating order, music, and so on facilitate drinking with decorum. From this, he says, I know that it is possible to gather in harmony and joy without becoming dissolute. The example works tacitly as a kind of a fortiori argument. If ritual can keep even a kind of booze up from getting out of hand, then it must be capable of ordering all aspects of life. This is interesting to think about the modern day fraternity as a failure to execute, right? So they have all these rituals, but things absolutely get out of hand nonetheless. This example might make us wonder whether Xunzi is even talking about the same phenomenon that was at stake in our other texts. There, the focus seemed to be on a specific kind of ritual in which something is apparently being offered or sacrificed in hopes of getting something else in return. So that's why we've had so much talk of sacrifice as well as ritual. What we have with the village drinking ceremony looks more like custom or even etiquette. And this is not entirely wrong. If we look back at the Lunyu, the Analects, we find that the concept of li, or ritual propriety, is illustrated with many etiquette-like examples. In fact, Amy Olberding, a scholar of Confucianism, even suggests translating li as etiquette rather than ritual. So, for example, we have the famous case of Confucius, Confucius, straightening his mat before sitting down. So this is one of my favorite examples. So obviously the Lunyu is just these little passages, one after another, and one of them just says, whenever Confucius sat down, he would first ensure that his mat was straight. And that's it. And I have had the experience of teaching this class in a seminar and spending a half hour talking about that sentence. There's a lot to say about straightening the mat. A less famous case would be, but I think an equally revealing case, would be a scene in which Xunzi courteously welcomes a blind music master and makes him feel at ease by helping him to his seat and saying who is present. Xunzi's point about bringing desires under control for the sake of more harmonious social relations can also be illustrated with passages from the Lunyu, such as this one: when the master dined in the company of one who was in mourning, he never ate his fill. Still, it would be wrong to say that Chinese rituals had nothing to do with transactional sacrifice, or that Xunzi was uninterested in this phenomenon. To the contrary, a central motivation of his theory of ritual is to reject a utilitarian conception of ritual, which he sees as inadequate and impious. Hence, what is probably his most famous remark about rituals: one performs the rain sacrifice and it rains. Why? I say, there is no special reason why. It is the same as one does not perform the rain sacrifice and it rains anyway. And that, when I read that, that made me want to write this lecture. This is the sentence, or maybe that's more than one sentence, but this is the passage that got me thinking about all this. Like, how can he say that? How could that make sense? He here refers to one of many rituals whose history goes back before the Warring States period. From humble peasants all the way up to the emperor, the son of heaven, sacrifices were carried out in hopes of receiving benefits like favorable weather, recovery from illness, or political success. We can see this in the oracle bone inscriptions, which are some of the earliest written material from China, or indeed from anywhere, and which show how gods and ancestral spirits were offered precious items like jade, or sacrificed animals in hopes of divine aid. The Zhou dynasty, whose period of rule seemed to the Confucians an earlier age of harmony and order that could provide examples for emulation, claimed to have received a mandate from heaven itself, which meant that the Zhou's overthrow of the previous Shang dynasty had been legitimate. Elaborate courtly ceremonies were used to reaffirm and perpetuate the relationship between the Zhou rulers and the divine. We find an echo of these ideas in another Warring States philosophical movement, which is to Xunzi the equivalent of Porphyry for Iamblichus or the Buddhists for the Gita, the opponent that helps provoke him into developing a theory of ritual. The Moists were consequentialist thinkers who thought that all social and political life should be based around the idea of maximizing benefit for everyone, all those who live under heaven. For them, benefit means three things, primarily, namely wealth, a growing population, and social order. It has been argued that, no less than the Confucians, the Moists tried in pursuit of these goals to rehabilitate and restore religious ideas from the earlier Zhou period. It would fit with that interpretation that they seem to accept without hesitation a do ut des, so we give so that you give, conception of ritual and sacrifice. In fact, one of the reasons they think it's important to maintain wealth is that this makes it possible to sacrifice to the ghosts, or ancestral spirits, with pure wine and grain, plump sacrificial animals, and valuables like jade tablets, coins, and silk. On the other hand, the Moists heavily criticized what they saw as the excessive ritual practices endorsed and overseen by Confucians like Xunzi on the grounds that they were wasteful. Also, by the way, on the grounds that they undermine population growth, because when people are mourning, they don't make new children. And they said, this is disastrous, we need to mourn for a few hours or whatever, not for 3 years, like the Confucians say. So one should do enough to appease the spirits and show filial piety, but no more than that. Thus, for instance, when arranging a funeral, one should not make the coffin thicker than needed to protect the corpse while it decays, or the burial mound higher than necessary to mark the spot. They always say, just do enough, then stop. That's like a slogan of the Moists. Xunzi was outraged by this pragmatic approach, which to his mind debased the lofty practices of ritual and fundamentally failed to understand their function. In his chapter on ritual, he explicitly attacks the Moists, saying that with their thrifty approach, they in fact cause the people not to benefit, but to lose twice as much. He launches into a lengthy defense of what may seem over-elaborate funeral and mourning ceremonies. At no stage does he suggest, though, that we need to invest resources in these ceremonies because heaven or the departed spirits would expect it or grow wrathful if we are too stingy. To the contrary, the rituals set a perfect standard, which he compares to an ink line, so something like a standard for straightness, which expresses our attitudes toward the deceased. It is the means by which one sets a limit for the utmost hurt. He agrees with the Moist that one should stop at the appropriate limit, but for him this limit is not set by crass material concerns. Rather, it is determined by the virtuous relationship the living has with the dead. The former kings and sages accordingly established a middle way and fixed a proper measure for it, such that once mourning is made sufficient to achieve good form and proper order, then it stops. Notice the echo of the Moist, then stop, right? One might be tempted to think that Xunzi is advancing a deflationary or even anti-religious theory of ritual. Like Kongzi and Mengzi before him, Xunzi certainly refers regularly to heaven, and even refers to it as one basis for the sage king's devising of rituals. He says, the sage kings took an image from heaven above, they took an image from earth below, they took a standard from humans in the middle, and then the order by which people are to live together in harmony and unity was complete. But heaven is for him a very impersonal force, which seems at times to be nothing other than a word for fate, or for events that are not under our control. He says, that which is accomplished without anyone's doing it, and which is obtained without anyone seeking it, is called the work of heaven. What may seem a rather agnostic approach to heaven and its will, if it even has a will, can be traced back all the way to the Lunyu. There, Kongzi admits that he cannot explain a certain important sacrifice, but adds that someone who could explain it would handle the world as if he had it right here, pointing to the palm of his hand. In another anecdote, he dismisses his student Zilu's request to learn about the ancestral spirits, saying, "You do not yet understand life, so how could you possibly understand death?" It seems more plausible, though, to take these and other passages as indicating a respectful distance from heaven and the spirits, rather than as an attempt to question traditional beliefs about these supernatural entities. This is another rationale, perhaps the most important one, for Xunzi's resistance to the transactional view, as best exhibited in that remark about the rain sacrifice. As one scholar of Confucianism has written, expecting a certain result to ensue from a ritual would be to encourage confusion regarding the proper separation of what is human and what is heaven. Heaven is nothing that humans can influence or control, much as the virtuous person ignores those who are less worthy. Heaven does not stop producing winter because humans dislike cold. Earth does not stop being broad because humans dislike huge distances, and the gentleman does not cease his conduct because of the chatter of petty men. Oops, sorry. If you're picking up on an elitist tendency in Xunzi here, you're not wrong. In fact, one of the primary functions of ritual in his view is to reinforce social hierarchy. He writes, "Ritual is a means of nurture. The gentleman not only obtains its nurturing, but also loves its differentiations. What is meant by differentiations? I say, it is for noble and lowly to have their proper ranking, for elder and youth to have their proper distance, and for poor and rich, humble and eminent, each to have their proper weights." This constitutes another disagreement with the Moists. As we've seen, they put a high priority on social and political order, this being the third of the kinds of benefit that they're prioritizing. But they were critical, that is, the Moists were critical of the elite for their failure to rule with the common welfare in mind and for wasting resources on luxuries, including the elaborate rituals fetishized by the Confucians. Xunzi's elitism would, by contrast, serve as a final point of similarity between him and two other defenders of ritual we have discussed. Iamblichus and the Gita were holding the line against forces of critique that sought to destabilize the established order, in which a priestly caste served as intermediaries between the human and the divine, or at least as advisors on how best to maintain that relationship. The Neoplatonic theurgist, the Vedic Brahmin, and the Confucian scholar were, in their different ways, all playing this role. Our texts deny that this was a matter of persuading unearthly masters to bestow earthly rewards, fulfilling our all-too-human desires by extracting a payment for services rendered. They are all deeply skeptical about that sort of transactional view, not because they are philosophers who have doubts about religion, but because they are philosophers who think that religion is about more exalted and fundamental concerns. Thanks.
So we'll open up for questions, and we'll ask if you have questions. Come down either side and use the microphone here. Then after Peter entertains the questions, we have a reception that is at the room upstairs beyond here. So thank you. Please come to the microphone.
Thank you for this beautiful lecture, and I'm really happy to see that ritual is taken for serious philosophical consideration. If I could play the role of the devil's advocate, though, I'm not sure that the Bhagavad Gita argument entirely succeeds, because there is in Mimamsa sort of rituals that are theorized that are not associated with desires. They call them nitya karmas, or obligatory rituals, and what they are for isn't quite clear in Mimamsa. It's a generally negatively defined loss of heaven or diminution, something of the kind. So the Agnihotra, for instance, is generally of that kind, but when instead of milk one offers yogurt, then it's theorized as being for heaven. So it seems to me that what the Bhagavad Gita does is applies the same principle by involving action that's offered to the Lord, transinstrumentalizing the ritual, but then switching the purpose to lokasangra, or keeping the worlds together. Yeah. So not entirely sure that as a historical argument succeeds.
Yeah, so I think it's actually similar to what I was saying about the Confucians. So when Xunzi talks about the rituals surrounding the drinking ceremony, there doesn't seem to be any transactional idea there, right? So you're right that it's not the case that in these cultures all rituals were seen as being transactional, and then that in the three texts I was talking about, there's a shift to thinking about none of them as transactional. Rather, we have a shift from thinking about some rituals as transactional to no rituals as transactional. So, I mean, if you want, I guess perhaps you could use the word sacrifice to pick out. I'm not sure that's right either. So I thought about this, like with the relationship between ritual and sacrifice. But I think there are also sacrifices that are not intended transactionally. You just gave an example, in fact. So I wasn't trying to argue that the Gita is saying, no one has ever thought that ritual could be anything other than a request for aid, right? But I think it is, among other things, critiquing the subset of rituals that are requests for aid. And I think that's probably true for all three of the traditions I talked about.
Thank you.
There's another mic over there, by the way, if anyone wants to line up on this side.
Great, thanks so much. Really fascinating. So I have a clarificatory question about Iamblichus and Porphyry. So if I understood correctly, and please correct me if I got anything wrong, if I understood correctly, part of the goal of ritual for Iamblichus is becoming more like God. And you also mentioned something about the justification here being beyond reason in some way.
Yeah.
But I would have assumed that we know about the gods through reason. And so we have a sense of what it is to so then how do we know that through these rituals we are actually becoming like God? That's the main question I want to ask.
So I think it depends whether you ask Porphyry or Iamblichus. Right. So Porphyry would agree with what you just said, but Iamblichus would say, so he would of course say the goal is to become like God insofar as is possible, quoting Plato himself in the Theaetetus. But he would say that we have a lot of information about the gods that we would not have been able to acquire through reason. Where do we get them? Through revelation. So go read the Chaldean oracles, for example. Right. Go back into the mists of time, and you'll find these Ur texts, which are often not as old as he thinks they are, right? Yeah. But they will tell you all kinds of things about the gods that you wouldn't have been able to figure out using philosophy. But maybe more relevant here is that the rituals themselves are somehow passed down through maybe oral tradition or, so you don't even necessarily have a text telling you why. It's not like he can point to a passage in the Chaldean oracles for every kind of ritual that the theurgist performs. It's more like a set of practices that's been passed down through the generations. Yeah. So there are, and this is of course true in other religions too, right? So we have revelation and practice, oral tradition as sources of knowledge which supplement religious or philosophical knowledge. So, and actually that that touches on the themes of all the lectures I'm giving.
I was going to follow up about that. Good, yeah.
Because there's a sense in which, when we talk about religious thinkers being skeptical, that could obviously mean a number of things, and I'm sort of juggling numerous senses of that. But one of the most important senses is that they are skeptical of reason as a means of figuring out everything we need to know, right?
Yeah.
And one way that they express that skepticism is to say, well, if we didn't have a revelation, like we wouldn't know what we're allowed to eat. Something you find Jewish thinkers saying, or you wouldn't know how these theurgic rituals are performed.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, Michael.
Thank you, Peter. I just had a quick question based on some text. Iamblichus was talking about union with God.
Yeah.
And in one of the quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, it talked about imitation of God. And there is a difference between union and imitation, and is there a path from one to the other, or is there an emphasis also on imitation in the Iamblichus and also on union in the Bhagavad Gita?
So did you just call that a quick question?
It's quick for me to say it. It's not quick for you to answer.
Okay. Yes, good distinction.
It requires a book.
Good distinction. So I think that imitation could be maybe the first step of union, right? So remember what I was saying? So I was drawing this comparison, which I hope is not too forced, between the function of the ritual and the way a Platonic form works when something participates in it, right? That's imitation. So we have a paradigm, we have an image, and the image is like the paradigm. That's the idea, right? And now the image is in no sense being unified with the form, right? So in general, it doesn't look like imitation will be the same thing as union, but it might be the first thing you need to do to step onto the road of union. And then the question is, what else do you need to do, right? So one answer might be to do a lot of reasoning, to go back to the previous question. So philosophy will get you there. And that's probably what someone like Plotinus would say. But another answer might be you need to ask the gods to bring you up, to pull you towards them in as much as is possible. So you're not going to you probably won't become a god, right? But, or you might actually in Neoplatonism, but even if you don't, you can become more divine or more like the gods, closer to union with the gods through this kind of divine gift of pulling you upwards.
So, but how is becoming more like becoming united or becoming more united?
Well, I was thinking of union as the sort of limit case of imitation, right? So if you think of imitation as achieving similarity, you could think of union as the elimination of all difference, and thus as a maximal case of similarity. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. If
there was no difference at all, so me and my brother again, right? So the reason he's not giving this lecture is because for all our similarity, there are still some differences. Like he's sitting over there and I'm sitting over here. And if there were no differences at all, like I don't need to tell you of all people.
Of course.
Right.
So perfect similarity is a kind of identity in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of making that up just now. That probably is something
people have said this before,
thought.
but
But I think that's a very Neoplatonic thought. Yeah, actually, because especially when you consider that at the top of the hierarchy you've got the one, and so as you kind of move up that hierarchy, you're becoming more and more similar to something that is just unity, right? So I think that's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So you presented ritual and ritualized action sort of in partnership with intention, whatever that intention might be. I vaguely remember there's also some sort of anthropological discussion about separating ritualized action from intention, because oftentimes, a society folks could be performing these actions because it's the social norm, because it's what was done. And so there is no intention behind it. Yeah. And so I was wondering if, in your research with all these texts and with the literati in these societies, that you see the acknowledgement that there may be non-intentional ritualized
Yes,
action.
definitely. Yeah, so I mean, I think we should distinguish two cases. One is the thing that the Gita is especially interested in, which is non-attached action. So I kind of know what the purpose of the action would be, but I don't mind what happened. Like, I don't mind in the British sense of, well, whatever happens, you know, like, so that would be like I wear my Arsenal shirt without caring whether Arsenal wins, and I'm not going to be upset if they don't win. I have not achieved this, clearly. Okay, so that's one idea. But then there's another idea, which is maybe closer to what you're thinking, which is that we aren't even aware of what the putative intention would be. And you can see that, I think that came out most clearly in the passage where Confucius said, I don't know what this ritual is about. I can't explain it. Someone who did could hold the whole world in their hands, right? So what he's saying is, I mean, it's like an expression of modesty, of course, but it's also an expression of the importance of ritual in the complete absence of any understanding of what the ritual is even about, which is like a really radical example of what you're saying. And if you take that seriously, then you need to think of, well, like what's going on here, right? Like I don't even know in theory what it would be for. And then the answer would be something like what Xunzi says, which is, well, you get social order out of continuing to perform these rituals. That's what they're really for. Whether that's what we want to tell hoi polloi is another matter, of course. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So my question actually picks up on the last question, but it's about the role of teleology, or even the rejection of teleology in some of these cases. Because one of the themes you came back to is the idea that rituals might be performed, rituals might not be for the sake of anything. They might not be performed for a reason. And there was a suggestion, particularly in the Arjuna case, the Bhagavad Gita case, that by acting without a purpose or not for a reason, the kind of value of that is you're thereby mirroring something like the gods again, right? So the gods don't act teleologically, they don't act for a purpose. Mm-hmm. So by doing that, you're kind of mirroring the gods. And the suggestion is the value of ritual might precisely lie in its non-teleological nature, because it's by engaging in non-teleological actions that you sort of mirror the higher order. So I'm just wondering if you'd say a little bit more about the notion, and this may just be specific to the Gita, it might be more general, that first the higher order of nature is sort of non-teleological.
Right.
It's kind of expressing some nature but not acting teleologically. And then just talk, if you could, talk a little bit more about the idea that maybe the higher state of being consists in acting not for the sake of reasons or not for purposes.
Right, that's good. Well, I mean, I guess my first thought is that you just expressed that so well that I'm not sure what more to add. So you're absolutely right. I think that's really well taken, what you just said. One thing I would say, though, is that so let me take the Greeks and the Chinese case, because those are the first two things that occurred to me. So in the Greek case, we have a long tradition. This is something that we see clearly in Alexander of Aphrodisias, for example. He's actually an Aristotelian, not a Platonist, but this is an idea that gets picked up by Platonists, that the higher never acts for the sake of the lower. Now, that doesn't rule out that they might ask for the sake of something, like something that's even higher than them. But Alexander says the gods providentially produce natural order, kind of without even knowing that they're doing it, and certainly not with the intent that they do that. So, for example, the sun is going around the earth in their cosmology, right? And it produces the seasons, which is good, and a kind of order, but it's not why the sun is moving, right? So that sort of asymmetry between higher and lower is often connected to this lack of teleological purpose. And so in a way, you can see, this sort of goes back to Michael's question, if I was trying to get myself up to the levels of the gods, then I shouldn't be doing anything for the sake of what's down here, because they don't do that either, right? And I think we can find maybe a somewhat similar idea in the Chinese case, which, so think about the Mohists. So the Mohists think that when rulers act for the benefit of all under heaven, they are imitating heaven. How do we know that heaven wants the benefit of everyone? Because we see that the wicked are punished and that the virtuous prosper, supposedly. I guess, like, eventually, we can look forward to this. And whereas the Confucians don't seem to think that at all. So the Confucians think of heaven as this sort of inscrutable source of just stuff you need to deal with. And your job as a sage is to be able to use whatever heaven sends well whether it's wealth or poverty or whatever it is, right? So again, it looks like the Mohists have a teleological notion of heaven, and the Confucians don't. It's, by the way, an excellent example of something I never tire of saying, which is that you shouldn't expect these non-Western traditions to all just say the same thing, right? I probably don't need to tell this audience that, but it's a really annoying feature of like popular conceptions of Indian or Chinese philosophy, that they all just line up and sort of say, what do the Chinese think about this? Well, they think lots of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, Alessia?
Hi, thanks. So the question is a bit connected to what you discussed. So from a big picture question about what you said yesterday, the whole project is about, and it's mainly focusing on Iamblichus because we kind of did it together. So in case of Iamblichus, I would be almost tempted to say that he really blurs the distinction between philosophy and science on the one hand and religion on the other, and you might almost say that he's doing almost philosophy of religion here. I mean, obviously he would not think about it like that, or maybe it's inappropriate, but I mean, it's very difficult for me to say, okay, but then discussing Iamblichus, which point is he supposed to prove? Is the religion that is skeptical or the philosophy that is dogmatic? I mean, because I guess reading him, you could think more or less both of him. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I guess how would he fit in your like more bigger picture? What does he prove?
Yeah. So I think when I say that pre-modern science or philosophy is often dogmatic, what I mean is dogmatic in the maybe dogmatic wouldn't even be the best. Because dogmatic isn't exactly the opposite of skepticism. The opposite of skepticism might better be something like very confident in its knowledge claims, right? So Porphyry comes and says, well, we kind of know all this stuff through philosophy. What's this with the theurgy? Why do we need this? And Iamblichus says over and over, you don't know as much through philosophy as you think, right? So in my kind of contrast, the idea would be that Porphyry represents the confident or dogmatic rationalist.
Okay.
At least in that context he does. In other contexts maybe he doesn't, because Porphyry is very complicated. But in that context, that's sort of his posture in the letter to Anibo, apparently, because it's lost, right? And Iamblichus is responding and saying, hold on a second, like, slow your roll, philosopher. You don't know as much as you think you do. And that's why he keeps saying, for example, if philosophy could do these things, we wouldn't need theurgy, which for him is a reductio. Right.
Yeah. So Iamblichus in this picture is Iamblichus quasi not qua philosopher but qua.
Absolutely. And he's speaking in the guise of an Egyptian priest.
Okay.
Right. So it's not just the things he's saying; it's the whole trappings of the discussion.
Yeah.
So we've got Porphyry as the rationalist inquirer writing to an Egyptian priest, and Iamblichus writing back as this other Egyptian priest. Right. That's not just decoration. Yeah. It also expresses something about his position.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, James?
Thank you very much.
The moderator is leaving. That means we can go as long as we want.
That's right. It's in Brenna's hands.
Okay. Brenna, you stop us if we go over time. Okay, go ahead, James.
Yeah, thank you very much for this stimulating lecture in comparative philosophy by juxtaposition.
Yes.
So I would like to share with you one of the connections, or dare I say comparisons, that arose in my head while listening to your lecture, and invite you to share your opinion should you have one. So it's really interesting, I find, focusing just on Iamblichus and Xunzi, that they both move past the Doute's paradigm for justifying ritual, but in opposite ways, it seems. Iamblichus seems to be saying, if I understood you correctly, that we should undertake ritual because it is entirely causally effective at producing results in a very, very restricted domain of theurgy.
Yeah.
And then theurgy has, follow-on effects that we can use for self-cultivation and approaching the divine. In contrast, Xunzi says that there is absolutely no link between ritual and the traditional effects that we are wont to ascribe to it. Instead, he justifies it in the rain sacrifice passage by saying that the gentleman will carry out the sacrifice anyway to culture the world, or rites, or enculture the world. And then in other the other passage that you mentioned as a sort of resource management to regulate our desires. So what do you think, what factor do you think could have led these two thinkers across two vastly different contexts to approach the same problem, namely that the Dao's paradigm was under fire, and respond in equal but opposite ways?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. Yes, and I think so I think the starting point for my answer would be something that was involved in your question, which is that, as you rightly said, theurgy is like a very specific thing. So you're not doing it all day, every day, right? It's when you put on your robes and you get your other philosophy friends together and you make a statue come to life, right? That's theurgy. Whereas, as we saw with the Confucians, you perform rituals when you sit down, right? Or when you welcome someone into a house, when you eat, when you sit watching a lecture. Everything you do, all day, every day. In fact, not even only all day. There's a passage in the Lunyu which describes how Confucius slept, right? And it doesn't say that, I don't think it explicitly says that's a case of ritual or ritual propriety, li, but the implication is there, right? And so I think you're right. There's a question about why that would be. And probably there's a lot that could be said about this. But my first thought here is that the political and social context is very different. So Iamblichus is writing in a situation where he's now in what is a minority religion, and certainly not the dominant religion, right? Because by his time, Christianity is become the imperial religion. And maybe he's not actually in a minority. I don't know the stats on his period, but it's certainly, paganism feels embattled in his time, right? But more importantly, Platonists have always been withdrawing and practicing a kind of internal cult, right? And I'm using the word cult in the technical sense here, right? Whereas what the Confucians were trying to do was get the warlords, really, because there was no son of heaven in their period. They're trying to get the warlords to hire them as consultants. That's their goal. So they are trying to be public figures, and they're trying to, I think they're promoting a kind of maximalist view of ritual, because they're trying to get the powerful and mighty to accept their advice on a huge range of topics, maybe even all topics, like here's how you should walk across the room, O Lord, right? But also here's how you should perform the rain sacrifice. And so that kind of different set of motivations and even maybe economic considerations, I think could be one reason for the disparity you're pointing to. But that's a pretty wild speculation on my part.
At least it's an interesting one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Wild and interesting often go together. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. So I had a question that was more on the topic of ritual broadly, but I guess like when I read more like recent scholarship on ritual, I'm thinking like Judith Butler, for example, and how like performance or ritual is a way to sort of inscribe externally and kind of transform the inner self through like performing these rituals. Whereas, I don't know, I guess like when I think of Augustine, who you mentioned yesterday in his Confessions, and he talks about his conversion and almost likens it to, I know he talks about like there's this part of his soul that was always connected to God and knew God even before he consciously knew. And so, yes, like ritual was a way in which like there was some kind of, I guess, like perhaps external stimulus, but it wasn't a way of like inventing himself as much as it was of just like sort of bringing out a part of himself that was more true. And so I was just wondering like to hear your thoughts on if that's like is that an accurate distinction of ritual nowadays being seen more as like this like outside in thing, whereas before it was kind of an inside out transformation. And I was also just wondering if like, is that unique to Augustine and I guess like just Christian thinking, or like what would other traditions say about that?
Right. Okay. Also a great question. So I mean, I think there's let's start with the sort of obvious thought that rituals are spiritual in nature, yet they're things that you do with your body, usually. So we do have talk here of like sacrificing thoughts and so on, but these seem to be extensions of an existing vocabulary, which was originally used to describe physical actions like pouring milk into fires or sacrificing pigs, cooking the meat, eating the meat together, right? So for someone like Augustine, who's also a Platonist or a pagan Platonist, the question is, there's a sort of a question in a way behind what Porphyry was saying, which is, we're Platonists, why are we doing anything physical at all, right? So as he said to Marcella, turn your mind into a temple, right? You don't need to, you could do everything you need to do with respect to the gods by just sitting in a chair and philosophizing, right? And so Iamblichus needs to deny that. Maybe Augustine would too, if you think about Christian rituals, which he would have been involved in. You could even think about like later discussions of the Eucharist in this way, if you really wanted to go crazy on this question. But the fundamental point would be that your kind of inside out, outside in thing is for them actually more like an up down issue. So I've got this transcendent soul which is immaterial, and for some reason I'm doing all this murky stuff down here with my body. Why? And so another way to think about Iamblichus's problem is that he needs to answer that question, right? I think in the modern days, since we're less apt to be hardcore dualists, we would conceive it more in terms of like my character or personality or psychology as opposed to the external world. So I think it's a rather different, just because the metaphysical picture is different.
Thank you.
Okay, Frank?
Yeah.
Last question. Oh, sorry.
Oh,
folks.
this is the last question. Thanks, Peter, for presenting to us a project the past 2 days that I'm deeply sympathetic with. But I want to put to you a question which is really a version of what Paul Franks asked yesterday about religion and your use of the category religion. And to some extent, you did actually respond to that, to the question on Iamblichus on the other microphone. But so my question is a clarification, and I thought you answered that. Insofar as in the dispute between Porphyry and Iamblichus, you seem to associate with Porphyry the status of a philosopher/scientist, and with Iamblichus as a religious thinker. And that's something I cannot accept. Insofar as I heard you last week at a meeting with grad students making the point that the study of philosophy should include theologians, a group of theologians such as the Mutakallimun, the Mu'tazilite Mutakallimun in Islam, meaning that both of them, I think, have their idea of religion, and both of them have their idea of philosophy. And the quantification of that, I think, is problematic.
Yeah.
And let me just illustrate it with the last point, which is, I know you're very familiar with, some in the audience might well. It seems a little bit like to say that Avicenna is the philosopher and Al-Ghazali is not, in the dispute between them, when we just look at the Tahafut al-Falasifa, which is a book where two philosophers basically talk to one another, which has in the past often been read as here is the voice of the philosopher and there is the voice of the theologian, but the book is deeply philosophical on both sides. So you
that's
probably...
Right. Yeah, that's right. And actually, I think that's a great parallel. So if you, I mean, it would be nice if we had Porphyry's letter, but I think still you could draw a parallel between, so Porphyry's position is like Avicenna's, and Iamblichus is like Ghazali's, and what they are doing is they are defending their conception of something we would think of as a religion, like pagan religious practices on one hand, and Islam on the other hand, and they are defending it against what they take to be a rationalist assault, right? But then they are using philosophical resources to do that, right? So I don't need to explain that in the case of Ghazali, especially to you, but I mean, he's doing a kind of internal critique of Avicennan philosophy, right? Whereas what Iamblichus is doing, and I hope this was clear from my argument, I wasn't saying that he stopped being a Platonist. I was saying that he uses Platonism to defend religion. So I think of Platonism, and I would also think of Kalam, actually, as something that spans the philosophy, theology / religion, religious divide, right? And I mean, you're right that there's a problem here of kind of how and whether we even could tease apart the philosophical part and the religious part. But as I said yesterday to Paul Franks, if we think that the kind of religious impulse to say, well, the gods are transcendent, there are certain things that I won't be able to understand about them rationally, but I've got this set of religious practices that tell me how to relate to them. If we think of that as religious, which I think is not crazy, then we can say that we're sort of seeing maybe the religious end of Platonism respond to the rationalist end of Platonism. It's more like that. That's more what I wanted to say, rather than that, oh, Iamblichus is religious and Porphyry isn't. Porphyry would absolutely say that, if you asked Porphyry, if you taught him English and said, Porphyry, are you religious? He would say, of course I am, I'm a Platonist, right? No one is more pious than I am. Actually, that's something you could ask him, are you pious? And he would say, absolutely. It's the theurgists who aren't, right? Because they are doing things like sacrificing pigs, which is like this sort of, low rent activity. And Iamblichus is saying, no, you haven't understood what it is to be pious. Okay, I guess we're done. Thanks.